listening to the J-Rock Podcast. This is J-Rock. Let's go.
Hey guys, this is J-Rock. We have a very special episode for you tonight. I'm actually going to have my wife on as a guest. Her name is Tawny Blankenship, and she knows a lot about rock music herself. Tonight she's going to kind of turn the tables on me, and she's actually going to do the interview. So let's get this started. First of all, let me go ahead and give a shout out to my sponsors. We have Fire Pit in Mann, West Virginia. Guys, if you want a amazing pizza, go to them. Their phone number is 304-583-7378. And they have good pizza, ribs. I mean, they have all kinds of good stuff. Definitely check them out. Also, we have Transamerica Insurance, Rebecca and Daniel Pennington. For a free life insurance quote, give them a call at 304-687-2311 or 304-946-1723.
Hey guys.
Hey guys, we're here with my wife, Tawny, and she's going to get this interview started. Woo! Tawny, go ahead and ask me some questions.
Okay. What made you decide to start this podcast, and why a rock podcast?
Okay, well, I have always had a fascination with rock music.
Yeah.
It actually started when my dad first introduced me to a rock band from the 70s called Foreigner. And I started playing guitar when I was in middle school. Had a music teacher by the name of Mrs. Bebera. She actually still teaches to this day at Mingo Central now, though. And she introduced me to guitar. The first song I ever learned on guitar was Wildwood Flower. It's actually a really soft song. But eventually I started, to learn chords and things, and I started playing rock music. I always had a love for rock music. I remember there was a store. It was actually located in Mann, West Virginia. It's called On Cue, and there's this little music store. And I remember when I first went there, and I picked up a Linkin Park Hybrid Theory album and a Creed album, the Weathered album, and things. And just my love for rock music continued to build and build. I was in and out of multiple bands, and now I try to talk to these other bands. I started this podcast because I wanted to better understand the mind of musicians, what their life was like,
just the creative process.
Yeah, their creative process, their day to day on average, and I just wanted to continue, to show my love for music. I mean, it's all, think about music. Besides my family, music, is everything to me. Family's first. Music is definitely second. Ever since I've started this podcast, I have made, multiple connections. I've got to better understand some of my favorite bands.
Yeah.
I've got to interview, people like Kelly McGregor of Memphis May Fire, Scott of Saving Abel. I mean, all these bands, and, I have multiple bands coming up. Hinder, when they come to Huntington.
That's going to be a big one.
Yeah, the V Club. I'm super pumped for that. Eve to Adam, when they come for Metal in the Mountains at Popstem. Yeah. Just all these bands. I love music. I love talking about it. I love creating it.
Yeah.
Now that's a lot that people probably don't know about me. I do this music, this rock podcast. A lot of people, don't know that I actually play music myself, and that I'm actually developing material on the daily basis, and hopefully to someday that will actually get to see the light that I hope that it will get to see.
Yeah, I bet a lot of your listeners don't realize that you and a friend created the intro to this podcast.
Yeah, that actually was really fun. I make up all of these little creative guitar riffs like all the time. That riff was actually, I had a Jackson guitar. Now I have a Paul Reed Smith. I'm, very into guitars, very specific too. Paul Reed Smith is a very specific brand. My amp is a Marshall. I focus on very certain materials. But anyhow, yes, I actually made that riff. I took the time, and I had a friend who allowed me to use his studio to record that riff. And we went through, play by play. We took it very serious. and I'm actually due for a new one. I've been working on it. I like that because that's putting my own twist on this podcast. I want people to, truly understand how much I love rock music, how big of a part of my life it is.
Yeah.
Yes, how much I appreciate it. It's very serious to me.
We go to a lot of shows and, music festivals and stuff. Has that been something that's inspired this podcast?
I would definitely have to say that it is. We've been to so many music festivals and shows, from Vans Warped Tour to, Carolina Rebellion to just, individual concerts.
Yeah.
And, yes, it truly does inspire. Vans Warped Tour was a big inspiration. Your favorite band, Silverstein, that we've seen multiple times that were, playing there, and Hawthorne Heights. Actually getting to meet those bands, not to mention, Matty Mullins of Memphis May Fire. Getting to meet him, got the picture with him, got to talk to him for a few. When I won that radio contest recently with Mike Shinoda, I think that was a very big ordeal for me. Mike, first of all, winning that, I don't know what it is.
Crazy.
I mean, a lot of people enter that contest for years and they never win.
I heard people at the concert saying they'd been in the fan club for 10 plus years and had never won. You were in it for what, a month?
1 month.
And you won?
And I got selected, and I remember when you were first telling me, you're like, honey,
I was the one that told you.
You're like, you've been selected. I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, right. And it turned out to actually be true. And when I got to meet Mike, I mean, it was just a huge moment. I mean, I was listening to his music from the early 2000s,
just like
2000
as a middle
on,
schooler.
and to get to see one of your role models who does multiple things. I mean. He's, had work with Fort Minor and Linkin Park, and now, his very own album, his very own tour. So, anyhow, with the Mike Shinoda ordeal, he was, so encouraging.
Yeah.
He talked to me. He said, thank you. That means a lot. Because I let him know. I said, you're my role model. You're, one of the reasons that I actually started this podcast. And I mean, it's the truth. He really. I mean, it was just so fascinating. Mike Shinoda, he plays keyboard, he plays guitar, he sings, his rapping skills, his lyrics that he writes, the work that he did with Chester Bennington from Linkin Park, Living On Forever. Bands like that, artists like that, definitely inspired me to develop this podcast. And I don't just want to be known for the podcast. I want to hopefully, show my appreciation of rock music and help it carry on by this podcast and by creating my own music material. I feel that that's something that a lot of people need to know. I don't just want to be known as J-Rock for the podcast. I want to, spread that love for music as much as possible.
So, in starting this podcast, there has to be good and, I guess, I wouldn't say bad aspects, but aspects that are not as great. What would you say those are? What would you say, you struggle with, or something that's hard? Or what advice would you give people who are starting a podcast? What mistakes did you make in the beginning?
Well, first of all, if you are going to ever start a podcast, I highly recommend that you clear your schedule as much as possible. You have to set a period of time and dedicate it to your podcast, just like anything else that you would do. You have to set the time for it. You can't just make excuses. You're having a bad day and you have a podcast scheduled. If you can at all, you need to do that podcast because it's not only just affecting you. Let's say that this band is set. I mean, if it's a music podcast like mine, when a band agrees to a podcast, they clear their schedule for you. And that's, time that they could be spending, on a new album, or maybe they have a show or whatever, and they've took that special designated time and they put it and placed it, for you. You need to do your best to accommodate that.
Yeah.
But I would say on the other hand of that is also, and we're talking about, basically pros and cons.
Yeah.
sometimes bands will, I don't want to say that they don't have a good excuse, but sometimes you will set the time aside for them and it ends up, they don't do the podcast. I won't mention any names, but very recently I had a podcast set. I advertised for it for a long time. I had a lot of listeners prepped. They logged on when it was time for the podcast episode, and the band or individual completely canceled, and they didn't even let me know they canceled.
Have you had contact with that person? Or
I have tried, and it's so weird because we were in contact on daily basis, prepping for this, and the person or the band seemed very excited, and then all of a sudden they just went just completely MIA. I don't understand what happened there, but it hurt a little bit with my listener count, which has built back up since then. I've had a lot of big podcasts since then, such as Memphis May Fire, and more to come.
Were you worried, or are you worried about things like that could affect your credibility as a podcast host?
I mean, I think that's something that you always have to consider and be worried about. If you care about what you're doing at all, you're going to get nervous and anxious about things like that.
Yeah.
And I can't, lie. Those things, weigh on the back of my mind. You do the best that you can. I like to prep a month at a time, at least, and have, multiple bands set for my lineup, my podcast episodes.
Beyond that, how do you prepare for, the podcast that day? What do you do to prepare for a podcast?
Well, one of the things that I like to do is I consider each band. I never want to say anything to offend a band.
So that you would say that there's a decent amount of research that goes into your podcast before.
Oh, yes, definitely. There's so much research that I do. I mean, from social media to, just diving into any information that I can pull on these bands. Within reason, like I said, I don't want to offend anyone. A lot of professional musicians are in and out of multiple bands, and you have to be careful because, you don't understand some situations that occur.
I know that you also have some that are, more private about things than others, some that might not want to discuss their personal life so much.
Yes, that's definitely a big one. When I call these bands, sometimes I end up speaking to an entire band. Sometimes it's one or two members.
Yeah.
You just never know. When I call them, at first, I don't put that automatically on the podcast. I speak to them for a couple minutes, and I let them know, I'm going to be asking you these questions. And I give them an early heads up, an idea. And if they don't want to answer a question, if it's too personal, too private, I give them the opportunity to opt out. That's fine. I understand. We all have things that we need to, keep to ourselves sometimes. Some things are personal. One thing that I think everyone should realize is, we're all human beings. And, these musicians, I don't know, we tend to idolize them and see them in a different light, but when it comes down to it, we're all just people.
Yeah.
Day to day, basis.
So what's the vision or, goal for the future of J-Rock Podcast? Where do you see it going and where do you want it to go?
Well, I would say that the future vision that I have for J-Rock Podcast is continuing to talk to as many artists as possible in the rock music field, considering that's what I've designated my podcast to, is rock music. I want to better understand these musicians. I want the world to. If you listen to my podcast, I want everyone to have better insight to what it's like to be in these bands and how they were formed and things. I like people to know that information, especially here in Logan, West Virginia. I've heard a lot of people say, well, rock music is dead in that area. If it's not country music, it won't sell out an area like the Big Sandy or, Charleston Civic Center. I've had people tell me, if it's not Florida Georgia Line, they're not going to sell out the Civic Center. that's a sad thing to say. When, in fact, we know bands have before. I'll bring up this one, and it was from 2005, and I'm really, going way back. I know this is 2019. X-Fest. I don't understand why we don't have more things like that going on in Huntington right now. It really upsets me. I know we have a decent amount of things in Huntington, but when X-Fest came in 2005, they had Seether, 3 Days Grace, Smile Empty Soul, who will be on my podcast hopefully next weekend. You had all these big bands, and Avenged Sevenfold. I mean, that was back, when the Red was still alive and everything. Not to mention the next year, the year after that, one of my favorite bands. I know you don't care much for them, honey, but that's okay. Nickelback, and that was a big concert and stuff. And you have rock concerts.
Why do you feel that X-Fest ended, though? I mean, you think it was like something personal with the people that were funding it and created it, or do you feel like they just weren't getting the turnout they wanted here?
Well, one thing, I actually just recently researched this. X-Fest was actually funded by a radio station in Huntington. And I don't understand. I know they had a huge turnout. I know we have big rock concerts in Huntington, too. And I'm not saying that we don't. I mean, I know we have Marilyn Manson and Rob Zombie coming up. And we have, Hinder and Saving Abel. We have some things. But we did used to have more. We used to have a lot more coming, and it's sad. And I want people to know in West Virginia, especially, that rock music is not dead. And I want people to know that. Like, we have people here that love rock music. My following on Spotify, J-Rock Podcast, has drastically increased. Over 1,000 likes on Facebook. We have a lot of people tuning in. We have a lot of people asking questions about these bands. So I feel like that's really, what I'm trying to look forward to in the future and trying to push forward.
I know you're sponsored by some local businesses, and you've reached out to some bigger companies. Who would be your dream sponsor for J-Rock Podcast?
Yeah, I've been sponsored by a lot of the locals. Hot Cup of Logan, West Virginia.
Which is a big deal, really.
Yeah. It's nice to see, even, these smaller businesses agreeing with me, on my dream of putting rock music out there. But, Hot Cup, Fire Pit, Transamerican Insurance, they've all been kind enough to sponsor me. You have a lot of businesses that will say one thing and do another. Unfortunately, I've had a lot of that happen. They didn't end up sponsoring me, but probably my dream sponsor would definitely have to be Monster Energy.
Yeah.
I would have to say that, or Rockstar Energy, simply because they sponsor all of these festivals. They
and a lot of music artists.
Yes, a lot of music artists. I have friends, professional musician friends, and they send them drinks while they're on tour. Taking care of the artist, and I think that's amazing.
Yeah, when I see the Monster logo, I automatically think of rock music.